What if the most dangerous room in Rome was not the Senate, but a private dining chamber on the Palatine Hill? What if the empire's brightest celebrations were built on rituals no one dared to name? Tonight, we step beyond the marble statues and golden coins into a palace where fear was law, silence was survival, and blood became a weapon. This is the story of an emperor who turned family into spectacle, grief into religion, and power into something far darker than madness. Stay with me, because what happened behind those closed doors did not end with one man's death. The palace that erases memory. He was trained to see nothing. He was trained to remember nothing. But tonight, memory refuses to die. The slave's name is Helotus, and in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, survival depends not on loyalty, but on erasure. He was purchased at 14, educated in silence, perfected in discretion, shaped into a living shadow that moves when commanded and dissolves when dismissed. For 4 years he has served inside the emperor's private dining chamber, the triclinium reserved for conversations too dangerous for Rome's marble halls. He has heard senators barter futures, watched generals beg for favor, refilled cups for men who decided which provinces would burn and which would prosper. But he has never felt fear the way he feels it tonight. The torches burn with a steady golden glow, perfumed oil thick in the air, silk curtains drawn tight against the world outside. At the center couch reclines the emperor, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Caligula, the boy once called Little Boots by soldiers who adored him. He is 25, tall and sharp-boned, his face restless, his eyes sometimes brilliant, sometimes vacant, as if something inside him flickers between presence and absence. On the couches beside him lie 3 women, adorned in translucent silk and jewels heavy enough to purchase cities. They are his sisters. Agrippina watches everything, her expression controlled but calculating. Drusilla sits closest to him, her beauty refined, her silence rehearsed. Julia Livilla, the youngest, drinks too quickly, as though wine can build walls where marble cannot. Caligula speaks of philosophy. He quotes Epicurus with polished ease, discussing pleasure as though it were an academic puzzle rather than a private obsession. His tone is calm, almost charming, and the sisters respond with measured intellect. It could resemble a cultured gathering of Rome's elite, an evening of refined debate and aristocratic grace. But Helotus notices the tremor in Drusilla's fingers when her brother's hand rests on her arm. He notices Agrippina's jaw tighten when the emperor's attention shifts to her. He notices Julia's wine cup emptying faster than reason allows. Fear moves through the room like an unseen draft, subtle but suffocating. The emperor sets down his cup, and the gesture is slight, almost careless, yet Helotus recognizes it as a signal. The conversation is ending. Philosophy has served its purpose. Something else now waits behind ritual. "You may go," Caligula says without looking at him. His voice leaves no space for delay. Helotus bows and walks toward the door, forcing his heartbeat into silence. As the heavy wood closes, he hears the emperor's tone change, no longer cultured, no longer measured. A soft protest escapes one of the sisters. It is not a word, only a sound quickly swallowed. Helotus walks away faster than dignity permits. He has learned the art of forgetting, but tonight, forgetting feels like betrayal of his own mind. 3 hours later he returns. The torches burn lower. The emperor is gone. The sisters remain. Silk garments are disordered, jewels displaced, carefully arranged hair reduced to tangled strands. Drusilla's tears fall without sound, carving silent paths down her cheeks. Agrippina sits upright, her face hardened into something beyond grief, something colder, something purposeful. Julia Livilla lies unconscious, wine still staining her lips, breath shallow but steady. The room smells not of perfume now, but of something heavier, shame woven into silence. Helotus begins clearing plates, his hands steady, his expression blank, because survival demands it. Yet inside him something fractures. Rome believes it has entered a golden age. The young emperor has granted amnesties, burned treason records, promised mercy after Tiberius's long paranoia. Citizens celebrate liberation. Coins gleam with images of unity and fortune. But behind the palace walls, family has become currency, and affection has become command. Caligula has begun rewriting what is sacred. He will not hide what he desires. He will sanctify it. And tonight, in a private chamber where witnesses are meant to dissolve, the first boundary has already fallen. This is only the beginning.
Bloodline as a weapon. He had watched his family destroyed by suspicion. Now he would rebuild it in his own image. In Rome, blood was sacred, but in the palace, blood became power. When Caligula summoned his sisters permanently into the imperial palace, Rome interpreted it as devotion. The young emperor, scarred by childhood tragedy, wished to keep the last fragments of his family close. That was the public explanation, and Rome was eager to believe it. His father, Germanicus, had died under shadows of conspiracy. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, starved in exile. His brothers executed or broken by treason charges. The empire had witnessed the systematic dismantling of his bloodline. Now, at 24, elevated to supreme power, Caligula presented himself as the survivor who would restore honor to the house of Germanicus. He spoke of unity, of shared suffering, of loyalty that only siblings could understand. Senators applauded because applause was survival. Citizens cheered because hope was easier than fear. But inside the palace, restoration meant something far more dangerous. Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla were not invited as independent women with households of their own. They were absorbed. Their husbands were quietly displaced, reduced to ceremonial roles that could be revoked at any moment. The sisters were moved into chambers connected directly to the emperor's private quarters, corridors guarded not for protection, but for control. Every movement became scheduled, every visit monitored, every appearance choreographed. Caligula began displaying them beside him during public ceremonies, positioning them not behind him as tradition demanded, but at his side, equal in visibility, elevated beyond Roman custom. He minted coins bearing their images, naming them security, harmony, and fortune, virtues embodied in living flesh. The message was subtle yet unmistakable. His reign was inseparable from theirs. To question one was to question all. But elevation can be another form of captivity. In Rome, noble women were symbols, not participants. Their influence existed within boundaries defined by law and tradition. Caligula erased those boundaries, but not to grant freedom. He erased them to remove resistance. By placing his sisters in sacred proximity to himself, he ensured that their identities dissolved into his authority. They became reflections of his power rather than individuals with will. Agrippina understood this immediately. She recognized the danger of proximity to a man who had survived Tiberius by mastering submission and calculation. Drusilla, closest to him in age and favor, learned quickly that affection could be transformed into expectation without warning. Julia Livilla, still barely past adolescence, retreated inward, her laughter fading into something brittle and rehearsed. Caligula framed everything as honor.
He spoke of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs who married within their bloodline to preserve divine purity. He invoked stories of Eastern monarchs whose dynasties were strengthened by sacred unity. He presented himself not as a violator of Roman taboo, but as a visionary restoring forgotten truths. If emperors were gods in mortal form, then ordinary moral codes did not apply. That was the logic he allowed to circulate quietly among courtiers. Fear carried the rest. Anyone who questioned the unprecedented intimacy between emperor and sisters risked accusation of treason. In Rome, treason trials had already consumed entire families under Tiberius. No one wished to test the new emperor's tolerance. Within weeks, the palace atmosphere changed. Ritual dinners became frequent. The emperor positioned Drusilla beside him as though she were an empress, touching her arm in gestures too familiar to dismiss as brotherly. Agrippina observed in silence, memorizing every glance exchanged between senators and servants. Julia drank more openly, her goblet rarely empty. The public saw splendor, unity, a dynasty reborn. The private chambers told a different story, one without witnesses brave enough to speak. Caligula had learned a lesson from his childhood. Power is not merely held, it must be displayed. And the most effective display is one that forces others to participate. What began as symbolic closeness was evolving into something Rome had never named aloud. The emperor was not simply keeping his sisters near him, he was binding them to him, transforming blood into a weapon sharpened by authority. And the empire, dazzled by youth and promises of renewal, had not yet realized that the price of harmony would be obedience beyond imagination. The ceremony that should not exist. What is repeated becomes normal. What is witnessed becomes accepted. And what is sanctified becomes untouchable. Caligula understood something that many rulers before him had sensed but never dared to perfect. The fastest way to silence outrage is to ritualize it. In private chambers, doors could conceal. In public ceremonies, spectacle could transform. If Rome could be made to watch without protest, then Rome would eventually forget it had ever been shocked. The emperor began slowly, never with declarations, always with gestures. At state banquets, he placed Drusilla at his side in the position traditionally reserved for a wife, her couch level with his own, her presence commanding the same attention as his. Agrippina and Julia Livilla reclined beside them, not as ornamental sisters, but as figures woven directly into imperial authority. Senators entered the hall and saw what custom forbade them to interpret. They lowered their eyes, praised the emperor's generosity, and pretended that the arrangement reflected only familial devotion. Privileges followed. Caligula granted his sisters honors usually reserved for Vestal virgins, Rome's most sacred women. They were given the right to attend public games in the imperial box, their persons declared sacrosanct, their movements accompanied by official attendance. The irony was deliberate and devastating. Vestal virgins were bound by vows of purity, protected by law, and punished with burial alive if they violated their oath. Yet these sisters, whose purity Rome whispered about in corners, were now elevated with the same sacred title. Caligula was rewriting meaning itself. He was announcing that sanctity was not determined by tradition, but by his will. If he declared something holy, then holy it became. The empire responded as it always did, with applause born from fear. Magistrates swore annual vows for the safety of the emperor, and for the first time included his sisters in the official formula. Soldiers across distant provinces pledged allegiance not only to Caligula, but to Agrippina and Julia Livilla as well.
Their names were spoken in barracks and temples, repeated in oaths that blurred the line between loyalty and worship. Refusing to include them was interpreted as defiance. Questioning the closeness between emperor and sisters was interpreted as conspiracy. The message traveled faster than decrees. Silence was survival. At one banquet, a senator allowed his gaze to linger too long on the emperor's hand resting upon Drusilla's thigh. It was a small mistake, barely perceptible, but Caligula noticed. The next morning, the senator was arrested on charges of plotting treason. Evidence appeared as if conjured by the gods. The trial was brief, the verdict predetermined, the execution immediate. Rome understood the lesson. Looking was dangerous. Seeing was fatal. Agrippina watched all of this unfold with a mind sharpened by memory. She had witnessed her mother's destruction under Tiberius, the way accusation alone could erase a life. Now she saw a new method of control emerging. Caligula was not content to rule bodies. He sought dominion over perception. By forcing Rome to witness what it dared not name, he entangled the entire empire in complicity. Every senator who applauded, every priest who recited vows including the sisters' names, every citizen who offered incense during public ceremonies became part of the illusion. The unthinkable had not only occurred, it had been normalized. Julia Livilla coped by drifting further into intoxication, her laughter thin and misplaced. Drusilla maintained composure in public, her beauty serene, her expression emptied of protest. The crowd saw harmony and divine favor. They did not see the tremor beneath the silk or the calculation behind Agrippina's stillness. Caligula had discovered that power could alter moral gravity. When enough torches burned, when enough voices praised, when ritual cloaked reality, even taboo could appear ordained. Rome was being trained to accept what it once would have condemned. And once acceptance takes root, resistance becomes heresy. The ceremony that should never have existed had become routine. And routine, in the hands of a god-emperor, was the most dangerous weapon of all. The sister who became a goddess. She was 21 when the fever came. He refused to let her die as a mortal. If he could not possess her in life, he would command her in death. Drusilla's illness began quietly, a persistent fever that palace physicians struggled to explain. Within days, the corridors of the Palatine grew tense, torches burning longer into the night as servants rushed between chambers. Caligula did not leave her side. He dismissed advisors, postponed hearings, and ignored military reports waiting for imperial attention. Rome whispered that the emperor had never shown such devotion, that his love for his sister surpassed ordinary affection. The whisper carried both admiration and dread. Agrippina observed from the shadows, her face calm, though she understood that whatever emerged from this illness would not restore balance, but shatter it completely. Julia Livilla remained half-drugged by wine, drifting between awareness and oblivion, perhaps unwilling to witness another fracture in the family that had already endured too much destruction. When Drusilla died in June of 38 AD, the palace fell into unnatural silence. She was 21 years old, her beauty extinguished before it had the chance to belong to her. Caligula's grief was immediate and violent. He tore at his garments, refused to cut his hair, wandered through halls at night calling her name as though she were hiding behind marble columns. Servants reported that he demanded to know why the gods would take what was his. He declared a period of mourning across the empire so severe that laughter became punishable. Informers roamed the streets of Rome, listening for signs of joy, for any sound that contradicted the emperor's sorrow. Several citizens were executed for failing to appear sufficiently mournful. Grief had become law. But Caligula was not content with mourning. Mourning implied loss, and loss suggested weakness. Instead, he chose transformation. He announced before the Senate that Drusilla would be deified. She would ascend beyond mortality and join the divine realm as Diva Drusilla, the first Roman woman to receive official godhood. The declaration stunned even those accustomed to imperial excess. Roman tradition reserved deification for emperors after death, not for young women whose lives had unfolded entirely within palace walls. Yet no senator objected. To question the decree would be to question the emperor's grief, and grief had already proven lethal. Temples were commissioned, priests were appointed. Statues of Drusilla appeared throughout the empire, carved with serene expressions that erased any trace of suffering. She was identified with Venus, goddess of love, her mortal history dissolved into sacred mythology. A senator publicly claimed he had witnessed her spirit ascending to heaven, welcomed by the gods themselves. Caligula rewarded him lavishly. Others followed with similar visions, eager to align themselves with imperial favor. What had been private horror was reborn as public devotion. Incense burned in her honor. Soldiers swore by her divine name. Citizens bowed before her image. Agrippina watched with unblinking eyes. She recognized the strategy beneath the madness. By elevating Drusilla to goddess, Caligula sanctified everything that had occurred between them. If she was divine, then their closeness could no longer be judged by mortal standards. The empire was now compelled to worship not merely a dead sister, but the narrative the emperor constructed around her. Refusal became sacrilege. Acceptance became survival. Julia Livilla trembled during the first public festival dedicated to Diva Drusilla, her cup shaking in her hand. She knew that the transformation erased more than grief. It erased truth. The woman who had endured sleepless nights and silent tears was now a symbol carved in marble, stripped of humanity and claimed by theology. Caligula had achieved something unprecedented. He had taken death and turned it into authority. He had forced Rome to kneel before his memory, and in doing so, he revealed a terrifying possibility. If a private violation could become sacred worship, then no boundary remained beyond his reach. Ashes on the wind. Desperation breeds courage, and courage invites betrayal. When fear becomes constant, even treason begins to feel like survival. But in a palace built on suspicion, secrets never remain buried. After Drusilla's deification, the atmosphere inside the imperial palace shifted from theatrical grief to something colder and more unstable. Caligula's public spectacles continued, but beneath the surface, the emperor's temper grew sharper, his trust thinner, his cruelty less restrained. Agrippina understood that mourning had not softened him, it had unmoored him. The transformation of a sister into a goddess had proven that reality itself could be reshaped at his command. If he could rewrite death into divinity, he could just as easily rewrite loyalty into treason. That realization planted a dangerous seed. Agrippina and Julia Livilla began meeting quietly with a small circle of senators and officers who had grown uneasy under Caligula's unpredictable rule. Among them was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, once married to Drusilla and still bound to the imperial household through proximity and ambition. Lepidus was not a heroic figure, but a cautious opportunist, a man who believed he could guide Rome back toward stability if given the chance. The conspirators spoke in guarded tones, aware that walls in the palace often carried ears. They discussed the possibility of removing the emperor, of replacing him with someone more controllable, someone who would restore the illusion of order. For Agrippina, the motive was not only political, it was survival. Every day under her brother's reign tightened the invisible chains around her future and that of her young son Nero. She had endured humiliation and ritualized silence, but she would not accept annihilation. The plan extended beyond whispers. There were letters exchanged with commanders in distant provinces, including Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, whose legions held real power. If Caligula could be removed swiftly, perhaps the army would accept a new ruler without plunging Rome into civil war. It was a fragile strategy built on hope and secrecy. But secrecy is fragile in a regime sustained by paranoia. Someone spoke. Whether it was a frightened servant, an informer seeking reward, or a conspirator breaking under pressure, the betrayal reached Caligula before the conspirators could act. The emperor's response was immediate and merciless. Gaetulicus was arrested and executed without trial. Lepidus was seized, tortured, and condemned. Under interrogation, he implicated others, whether truthfully or in desperation. Then Caligula turned to his surviving sisters. Before the Senate, he declared that Agrippina and Julia Livilla had conspired against him, that they had betrayed both empire and blood. The irony was suffocating. The man who had claimed dominion over their bodies now accused them of disloyalty. He framed their political alliance with Lepidus as moral corruption, suggesting intimacy as further evidence of treason. The Senate listened in silence, understanding that outrage would only increase the body count. Punishment followed spectacle. Agrippina and Julia Livilla were stripped of their honors and possessions, their names removed from official ceremonies. Caligula ordered them to carry Lepidus's ashes through the streets of Rome, forcing them to display the remains of the man whose death had sealed their fate. Citizens watched as imperial daughters walked in public disgrace, once revered as symbols of harmony, now reduced to condemned exiles. Agrippina's face revealed nothing. Years earlier, she had learned from her mother that survival required stone where emotion should be. Julia Livilla staggered beside her, weakened by fear and the lingering haze of wine that once shielded her from clarity. They were sent to the Pontian Islands, barren outposts where exile meant slow erosion rather than swift execution. As the ship departed, Caligula observed from the palace balcony, reportedly laughing. Rome exhaled in uneasy relief, believing the threat had been contained. But exile does not extinguish ambition, and humiliation does not erase memory. Agrippina carried more than ashes. She carried resolve. The empire believed the conspiracy had ended. It had only changed form. The last door on the Palatine. When a tyrant falls, Rome expects relief. But power never dies quietly. It simply changes hands and remembers everything. Exile was meant to erase Agrippina and Julia Livilla, to reduce imperial daughters to forgotten figures on barren islands where wind and hunger completed the work of humiliation. Julia Livilla's strength faded quickly under deprivation, her body already weakened by years of excess and shock. Isolation stripped away the last illusions of protection. Far from Rome's marble halls, titles meant nothing, and survival became a daily negotiation with scarcity. Agrippina endured differently. She had learned from childhood that suffering could be endured if it was converted into strategy. On the Pontian rock where she was confined, she did not collapse, she observed, she memorized, she waited. Every insult inflicted by her brother, every ritual humiliation, every night of calculated silence hardened into a single focused intention. If she survived, she would return. Meanwhile, in Rome, Caligula's rule spiraled further into volatility. The spectacle that once dazzled citizens began to exhaust them. His demands grew stranger, his punishments more theatrical, his belief in his own divinity less metaphorical and more literal. He appeared dressed as various gods, insisting that statues be altered to resemble him. He drained the treasury on extravagant games and monumental projects that glorified his name. The Senate trembled beneath the weight of unpredictable accusations. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal through cultivated favor, began to whisper. Fear that once protected him now surrounded him. A ruler who forces everyone to perform obedience eventually discovers that performance does not equal loyalty. In January of 41 AD, the tension finally reached its breaking point. A conspiracy formed not among distant generals or exiled sisters, but within the palace itself. Members of the Praetorian Guard, led by officers who had endured public humiliation at Caligula's hands, resolved that survival required decisive action. On a cold afternoon, as the emperor moved through a corridor after attending games, the conspirators struck. Blades flashed in the narrow passage. The man who had styled himself as a living god collapsed onto the stone floor, mortally wounded not by distant rebellion, but by the very guards entrusted with his protection. He was 28 years old. Rome did not erupt into celebration, it froze. The memory of civil war lingered in every generation. Without an emperor, chaos threatened. Senators debated restoring the republic, yet none possessed the unity or courage to dismantle the imperial system they had learned to endure. In the confusion, the Praetorian Guard discovered a trembling figure hiding behind a curtain in the palace complex, Claudius, Caligula's uncle. Awkward, scholarly, long dismissed as politically insignificant, Claudius was proclaimed emperor by the soldiers who understood that stability required continuity. The dynasty survived, even as one branch was severed. Agrippina was recalled from exile under Claudius's reign. She returned not as a broken victim, but as a strategist reborn. The trauma inflicted by Caligula did not vanish with his assassination. It echoed forward, influencing decisions, shaping personalities, staining another reign with instability and blood. History remembers Caligula as mad, monstrous, excessive. But beneath the legend lies a more unsettling truth. His tyranny was not sustained by madness alone, but by complicity, fear, and ritualized silence. An empire watched and chose survival over confrontation. Sacred ceremonies disguised private horrors. Worship concealed violation. When he fell, Rome did not cleanse itself of those patterns. It carried them forward. The last door on the Palatine closed over his body, but the lesson remained. Absolute power does not simply corrupt the ruler, it distorts everyone who lives within its shadow. And once a society learns to sanctify what it fears, it may discover that the most dangerous tyrant is not the one who commands, but the silence that obeys.